All right, for today's lesson, we're going to look at a special type of factoring. It's actually a special type of common factoring, and it's called factor by grouping. So just looking at our warm-up question right here, I want you to look at this expression, and I don't want you to expand it. I want you to factor it, and I want you to notice what's common. So there's two terms, okay, and you will notice that common to both of them is actually the a minus 4 term. There's actually a 4 common to both of them as well, so you could pull that out. But the main idea that I want you to see here is that the a minus 4 is common to both of them. So if I was going to factor that, I could write it as a minus 4. I could common factor that out, and then what I would be left with is 4a plus 8. Okay, so basically that's what we're going to be doing when we are common factoring, is that we're going to look for a binomial or something that's common to both pieces, okay? Now, the thing that we need to know about factor by grouping is factor by grouping always has an even number of terms. In other words, usually 4 terms in the polynomial, okay? So if we look at our first example, you'll notice that there's 4 terms. Okay, 4 terms right there. Okay, and what we want to do is we want to look to group the terms together, the ones that are alike. Okay, so you'll notice that the first 2 terms both have x in them, the second terms both have y in them, so you could group them like that. Oftentimes with factor by grouping, it is possible to group in a variety of different ways. In other words, in this one, you could potentially put probably the m term with the m term and the n term with the n term. But the idea is you want to group them into 2, so these ones are actually right beside each other already, and then you want a common factor within that group. So in that first group, there's an x that's common, and what's left over is an m minus an n. Okay, and then in that second group, there's a y that's in common between both of them. And what you need to do is you need to pull out what's common to both. You also need to pull a sign with it. Now, notice that one is positive and one is negative. So you're kind of a little bit guessing at this point, or you want to make it work out. But I'm going to try positive y. And then what I have left over is m minus n. So the way you know that you've done factor by grouping correctly is this binomial and this binomial have to be the same. So sometimes when you're dealing with that sign in between there, you do have to play around or think ahead a little bit or try a couple things to make sure that these 2 binomials are in fact the same. Okay, and once they're the same, it's exactly like the question up above, the warm-up question, because then you're going to common factor out that binomial. And then you ask yourself, what are you left over? What are you left with? You're left with x plus y when I common that out, and that is actually your other binomial. Okay, so that is called factor by grouping. We're going to try a couple more of those, and then of course you're going to practice a whole bunch of them in class. And again, the one thing that we really use to stand out to notice those is they tend to always have 4 terms. It has to be an even number of terms, but in general, you're going to see them throughout high school with 4 terms. Okay, so let's just try a couple more here. Okay, so let's look at this one. Looks like when you scan them at quick glance, looks like you maybe want to put your x terms together and then maybe your y terms together. So sometimes it is helpful. You might want to reorder the terms just to help yourself. So we have 10ax minus 15x. Then we have a plus 4ay minus 6y. Okay, and now in between those 2 groups, we have this group and this group. Let's common factor out. So in our first group, it looks like we have 5x that's common to both. So then what are you left with? You're left with 2a minus 3. Okay, and then in your second group, it looks like you have a 2 that's common and a y. Okay, and what are we going to be left with? We're left with 2a minus 3. And again, remember the goal is you need this binomial and this binomial to match so that in your final step you can common factor that binomial out, and then you're left with 5x plus 2y. Okay? Now, again, like I did the other day, it's really great if you could pause the video, try C on your own, and then come back and check when I, in fact, go through C. So take a minute, definitely pause it. Sometimes there are a couple different options, but here we go with C. Okay, so with C, sometimes you got to try a couple different things, and sometimes different things will work. What sort of stands out to me right at the beginning is I maybe want to group those 2 together, and then group the 16a with the 32 because I noticed that those are the same. A lot of times, again, the question would probably still work if you group together the first two terms and the last two terms here. You probably have a bunch of different options. Okay, but that's what I'm going to do. So I like to rewrite them beside each other. Okay. And then I'm going to common factor. I get a 4a, and then I get an a plus 2. Okay, and you'll notice in this one, it actually, both terms are negative, so it makes sense to pull out a negative 16. And then I'm left with a plus 2. And sometimes you have to think about that one, right? That's a plus because I've pulled the negative out. And even think of expanding back. Negative 16 times negative 2 gives you negative 32. Okay, and I do need those to match, and conveniently they do. And if I common factor out here, I get an a plus 2. And then I get a 4a minus 16. Now, one thing you might want to note in this actual particular example, and you might have caught this, is there's actually still a common factor here. So we could have looked at, like, for that from the beginning. We definitely could have factored 4 out right from the beginning and then done grouping. Okay, but even if you don't recognize it right away, but you catch it at the end, then that is okay. But so we do want to pull that 4 out. You can just put it right at the front, because of course the binomials, you can write them in any different order, and then I end up with a minus 4 left over. Okay, so again, we're going to practice lots of this in class. Just as a little summary, just please note that we have two strategies for factoring so far. First, we always look for a common factor, which I of course missed in the previous example, but you want to try to always look for that first. Okay, and then if there's 4 terms in particular, you're going to keep that idea in mind of factor by grouping. So you try this one all by yourself, and we'll take that one up first thing in class tomorrow. Okay, so please try that one. Pause the video if you need to, and be ready with your solution for class. See you tomorrow.